Hello S2 and welcome to S2 History. Our first topic is going to be the Vikings. Now, what you'll be learning in this topic, we are going to look at this week who the Vikings were and where they came from, and then the following weeks we will be looking at how they lived, so the Viking houses and food, how they moved around, so in their longships, life of a Viking warrior, what the Vikings' religion was like compared to our religion, the battles in Britain against the Saxons, and what happened to the Vikings in the end. Lesson 1 is who were the Vikings and where did they come from. Now, if you could write this heading in your jotter, if you have space in your jotter to do this. If you do not have space in your jotter to do this, and you'd rather type this up, then if you just put that heading at the top of your Word document. Now, what we're going to learn today. Today we're going to look closely at the Vikings, so who they were and where they came from. So by the end of the lesson, our three aims are this. All of you should be able to explain where the Vikings came from. Most of you should be able to explain why the Vikings came to Britain, and some of you may be able to imagine life as a Viking at this time. Now, to start with, what I'd like you to try and do, again if you're using a jotter, is to draw what you think a typical Viking would have looked like. Or, if you don't have access to a jotter, describe what you think a typical Viking would have looked like in a few sentences. So we pause the PowerPoint just now and just try this first warmer task. Okay, so who were the Vikings? This is just a bit more information, a bit of background about the Vikings. The Viking age in European history was from about AD 700 to AD 1100. The Vikings were a smart, creative, artistic and democratic people. Their society was built on law and order, very similar to ours today in terms of following law and order. In fact, the word law comes from Old Norse, which is the Viking language. Women had rights in Viking times and family is very important. They loved to spend time with their children. They loved their boats were very important for the Vikings to move around. They made everything beautiful. The Vikings took great care in everything they made. This included their clothes, their weapons and even their water buckets. They were very clean, so they liked to make sure that their hair was always well done, that their beards were always well trimmed. They created wonderful stories about their gods and goddesses, so again we will focus on this in more detail. You may have heard of some famous Viking gods and goddesses, probably one of the most famous being Thor. They loved games, especially games of agility or skill, and they were farmers, craftsmen, traders, explorers, looters and fierce warriors, so they had a large skill set. Now what they actually look like, if you think back to the warmer task, on the left hand side here is what many people would think of as a typical image of a Viking. So a warrior carrying his axe and his shield with a helmet with horns. Now, ultimately, the helmet and horns is actually a myth. Yes, Vikings did wear helmets, but they did not have horns on them. This is a myth. On the right hand side is a picture more accurately representing what Vikings actually looked like at this time. Now, where did the Vikings come from? If you use the following link on the PowerPoint here to watch the following clip from BBC Bitesize and try and note down where the Vikings came from. Now from that clip, you should have seen that the Vikings came from Denmark, Sweden and Norway. So this is the Viking homelands. The blue arrows are showing you their journeys from their homelands across to Britain. And this has a representation of the Viking settlement, so where the Vikings settled in Britain. So you can see that they actually settled in Scotland on the west coast predominantly and in the north. They settled in England, in Wales and in Ireland as well. You will see in terms of where the Vikings settled, they liked to settle close to the coast, which meant it was easy for them to move around, but also being close to the coast gave them access to water and obviously a food supply with things like fish. Now, using the map and the video that you have just watched, your map task is this. Use the previous slide to label your map, and your map's available on the next slide. Colour in where the Vikings came from, and colour in where the Vikings settled. And remember to put a key below your map. So if you colour in where the Vikings came from red, for example, make sure you do a wee red mark below your map and make a key there. Now, if you're unable to do this, so if you can't print off the map on the next slide, try and just write down the answers in your jotter, so where the Vikings actually came from and where they settled. So again, if you want to pause the PowerPoint when you see the map on the next slide, obviously you'll be printing this off so you can complete this task. If you can't print this off, as I said, just make sure you type this up or write it down in your jotter. and here's your map here. Okay, so we should now be able to explain where the Vikings actually came from. So that was our first aim today. Our second aim is to look at why did the Vikings actually come to Britain. Now, the northern part of Scandinavia is full of mountains. Now, Scandinavia is a term used to describe Denmark, Norway and Sweden, that area and those countries. Now, that is full of mountains. Soil along the coastline was very sandy at this time, so it was difficult to grow crops, which would then give them a food supply. In time, as the population did grow, some Vikings stayed because there was some good farmland in Sweden, in Denmark and in Norway. However, around 750 AD, some Vikings began to explore other places to raise their families, so they came to places like Russia, to Britain, France and to Germany. Now, Adam of Bremen in the 11th century said this about Norway. Norway is the harshest of all countries because of its rugged mountains and extreme cold. Forced by the poverty of their homeland, the Norwegians venture abroad to bring back from their raids the goods which other countries so plentiful produce. Now on the right hand side you'll see a picture of Norway there. You can see the mountains and the weather there, very very cold with the snow. So Adam of Bremen is telling us here that the Vikings left Norway to visit other places like Britain because of the mountains and because of the weather, but also, as you can see there where he says, venture abroad to bring back from their raids the goods which other countries so plentiful produce. So by coming to places like Britain, they could gain access to food, they could gain access to drinks, they could also gain access to valuables, which they could then use to make themselves richer, more powerful, or just improve their general life. Eagle Saga in the 13th century also tells us that in the summer they went on Viking voyages. They conquered land and divided the spoils among themselves. In the winter they stayed at home with their fathers. In those days it was easy to gain riches and honour. So another reason the Vikings came to places like Britain was ultimately to try and become rich and more powerful. Now the picture on the right hand side shows you some of the things that the Vikings would try and gather, so coins and bracelets. Ultimately, by coming to Britain, going on these raids, they could gain these valuables. Eagle Saga also tells us about King Harald Finnhere of Norway. So it says, King Harald Finnhere took over all the land, all the seas and the rivers. Everyone now had to accept him as their lord, even those who lived in the forest or travelled about. Many people left Norway to get away from this, and so many new lands were settled. People went to the Hebrides, Ireland, Dublin, Normandy in France, Caithness in Scotland, the Orkneys, Shetland and the Faroes, and it was now that Iceland was discovered. Now the first map here shows you some of the places in Britain that the Vikings also settled as well. The other map shows you Iceland. So Iceland was discovered at this time by the Vikings, and around Iceland there is routes that some Viking explorers went on. So ultimately another reason the Vikings left their homeland was to escape maybe a bad standard of living there. So under King Harald Finnhere, a lot of people weren't happy in Norway, so they came to places like Britain to settle and start a new life. Now, using the information that we've just discussed, why did the Vikings leave Scandinavia? Under your assignment tab on Microsoft Teams, you will see that there is a document with your tasks to complete. So your first task is, why did the Vikings leave Scandinavia? So you need to use the information that we've just discussed to answer that question. So the Vikings left Scandinavia because, so try and tell us some reasons why the Vikings left Scandinavia. So again, if you want to pause the PowerPoint at this point and try that first task. Okay, what we're going to try next is a usefulness question. Now, a usefulness question is a type of question that you will be asked in history. If you choose to go on and pick history in S3 or beyond for National 5 and higher, you will need to answer a usefulness question. Now, to answer a usefulness question, we use a mnemonic called cowpat. That is why there's a picture of a cow and cowpat there. Now, cowpat stands for something, and the something that it stands for is the C in cowpat stands for content. So that is what the source tells us. So you're going to tell us what is in the source, what does it tell us, and why is that useful. The O stands for omission, so what it fails to tell us, and why does that make it less useful. The W stands for when, so the date it was written and why this is useful. The P stands for purpose, so why the source was written and why that makes it useful. The A stands for author, so who's the author of the source and why does that make it useful. And T stands for type, so what type of source is it? Is it a book, is it a newspaper, is it a diary, and why is that useful? Now you will see that the C, the O, the W and the A are coloured red. Reason for that is these are the aspects of the source that we are going to focus on today. You can speak about the purpose and type, but for this question coming up, we are just going to focus on content, omission, when, and author. Now, let's look at the source that we will be answering this question about. So, source A is from a book by historian D.R. Baker in 1966. Source A says, "The men from the north were an even greater menace. They came over in sleek and beautiful vessels and brought death and destruction to every land they visited. A constant watch had to be kept for their ships. A glimpse of one of their striped sails off the coast of Britain, Ireland or France, and the war horns would sound and church bells toll. Brave men would rush to arms and cowards flee. Cattle and sheep would be driven into the forests, and priests would bury their treasures." And your question is, how useful is source A in telling us about the Vikings? So you have this source here. This source is from a book. It is by historian D.R. Baker in 1966. The source is about the Vikings. So we are being asked, how useful is it in telling us about the Vikings? Now, a usefulness question is worth 5 marks. And we're going to use the structure on the next slide to help us to answer this question. So use this structure to help you to answer the question. So we're going to start off by saying the source is quite useful in telling us about Vikings. Now if you remember, the C comes first, so that's content. So what does the source tell us? Now we try and make 2 points here. So we have, the source is useful as it accurately says, "The men from the north were an even greater menace." This makes the source useful as it is accurate. So that would be 1 mark there. You then have your next point. So the source is useful as it accurately says, and it has pick another quote. So you need to pick another quote from the source about the Vikings. And again, make sure you say afterwards, this makes the source useful as it is accurate. So that would be 2 marks so far. Then the next part to answer this question is O, which stands for omission. So what does the source not tell us? So you'll see here it says the source is less useful as it fails to tell us, times 2. So you need to tell us 2 points about the Vikings which is not mentioned in the source. Now make sure these 2 points are both done as 2 separate points. So you're going to say the source is less useful as it fails to tell us. So tell us something about the Vikings which is not in the source. And again, below that, you will then say the source is less useful as it also fails to tell us, and tell us another point about the Vikings which is not mentioned in the source. And if you do that twice, that would be 4 marks. Now the next one, W, has been done for you, so that's when the source was written. Okay, so it says here the source was written in 1966. Now because this was a long time after the Vikings, we can say this makes it useful as it's been written with the benefit of hindsight. So that means that the author being able to look back over time, look back at documents with the benefit of hindsight to write the source. So that would make it a secondary source. So because the W has been done for you, if you've done 2 points from the source, so 2 content points, and then 2 omission points, and then the when, that would be 5 marks if you do that properly. So 5 out of 5. However, because the W has been done for you, we're going to try and do A. So the A stands for author, so who wrote the source. So if you look back at the source, you're going to say the author of the source is, so put the name of the author, and then you're going to say why that makes it useful. Now if you think back to the source there, remember the author is a historian. So think about why a historian would make the source useful. What is a historian's job? Why is it useful that they've maybe written that source? So again, if you pause this at this point here on the PowerPoint, this sheet here is again under your assignments tab on Microsoft Teams. So it says there, use this structure to help you answer the question, and you have the structure there, so you just need to fill in the blanks ultimately. So again, if you pause the PowerPoint here to try this task. Okay, and our very last task for today is just recapping what we've learned about the Vikings. So task 3 is our planner, which is fill in the blanks. Now again, this image here is from your document, which is available under the assignments tab. So using what we've learned today, you need to try and fill in the blanks from that passage there. Okay, so that is week 1, lesson 1 of the Vikings. So our 3 aims by the end of the lesson. All of you should be able to explain where the Vikings came from. So think about that. Can you name the 3 main countries that the Vikings came from? Most of you should be able to explain why the Vikings came to Britain. So again, think about the reasons that they left places like Norway, Denmark, Sweden. Why did they leave those places to come to Britain? And some of you may be able to imagine life as a Viking at this time. So think about, if you were a Viking at this time, what would life have been like if you were having to move around from place to place? How do you think people would have felt? And that is lesson 1, week 1 of the Vikings.